Later Crusades, 12911-717, Reconquista, 722-1492, Northern, 11471410, against Christians, 11071588, Popular, 10961320, the War of the League of Cambrai, also known by its second stage as the War of the Holy League, was fought from December 1508 to December 1516. As part of the wider Italian Wars of 1494-1559. The main participants of the war, who fought for its entire duration, were France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States, and the Republic of Venice. They were joined at various times by nearly every significant power in Western Europe, including Spain, England, the Duchy of Milan, the Republic of Florence, the Duchy of Ferrara, and the Swiss. The war was preceded by the Italian zug of Maximilian I, King of the Romans, who crossed into Venetian territory in February 1508 with the imperial army on the way to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in Rome. Meanwhile, Pope Julius II, intending to curb Venetian influence in northern Italy, brought together the League of Cambrai, an anti-Venetian alliance consisting of him, Maximilian I, Louis XII of France, and Ferdinand II of Aragon, which was formally concluded in December 1508. Although the League was initially successful, later frictions between Julius and Louis culminated in the Pope abandoning the League in 1510 and allying himself with Venice against France. The Veneto-Papal alliance eventually expanded into the Holy League in 1511. That was also joined by Spain. The League drove the French from Italy in 1512. Later disagreements about the division of the spoils, however, led Venice to abandon the coalition in favor of an alliance with France in 1513. Under the leadership of Francis I, who had succeeded Louis on the throne of France, the French and Venetians would regain the territory they had lost in a campaign culminating in the Battle of Marignano in 1515, the Treaties of Noyon, August 1516, and Brussels, December 1516, which were implemented by January 1517, would essentially return the map of Italy to the status quo of 1508. This is an overview of notable events including battles during the war and the aftermath of the First Italian War, 1494-1498. Pope Alexander VI had, with French assistance, moved to consolidate papal control over central Italy by seizing the Romagna. The illegitimate son of the Pope, Cesare Borgia, acting as gonfalonier of the papal armies, had expelled the Bentivoglio family from Bologna, which they had ruled as a fief, and was well on his way towards establishing a permanent Borgia state in the region when Alexander died on August 18, 1503. On August 7 of the same year, another peace agreement was reached between the French and the English. The death of Louis XII on January 1, 1515 brought Francis I to the throne. Having assumed the title of Duke of Milan at his coronation, Francis immediately moved to reclaim his holdings in Italy. On June 27, the new French king renewed the alliance with the Venetians. By July, Francis had assembled an army in the Dauphin. A combined Swiss and Papal force moved north from Milan to block the Alpine passes against him, but Francis, following the advice of John Giacomo Trivulzio, avoided the main passes and marched instead through the valley of the Stura. The French vanguard surprised the Milanese cavalry at Villafranca, capturing Prospero Colonna. Meanwhile, Francis and the main body of the French confronted the Swiss at the Battle of Marignano on September 13. The Swiss advance initially made headway. However, Francis's superiority in cavalry and artillery, together with the timely arrival of Alviano, who had successfully avoided Cardona's army at Verona on the morning of September 14, led to a decisive victory for Francis and the Venetians. After the victory at Marignano, Francis advanced on Milan, capturing the city on October 4 and removing Sforza from the throne. In December, he met with Leo at Bologna. The Pope, who had in the meantime been deserted by the remainder of his Swiss mercenaries, surrendered Parma and Piacenza to Francis and Modena to the Duke of Ferrara. In return, Leo received guarantees of French non-interference in his proposed attack on the Duchy of Urbino. In January 1516, King Ferdinand II of Aragon died and was succeeded by his grandson, the future Emperor Charles V, who became sovereign of all Spanish and southern Italian realms. Although Cesare managed to seize the remnants of the papal treasury for his own use, he was unable to secure Rome itself, as French and Spanish armies converged on the city in an attempt to influence the papal conclave, the election of Pius III, who soon died, to be replaced by Julius II, stripped Cesare of his titles and relegated him to commanding a company of men-at-arms. Interested in securing his rule over the Kingdom of Naples, Charles entered into negotiations with the French King. Charles was ready to recognize French claims to Milan, while Francis decided to recognize Spanish claims to Naples. On those bases, the Treaty of Noyon was concluded between Charles and Francis in August 1516, thus removing Spain from the war. Maximilian held out, making another attempt to invade Lombardy. His army failed to reach Milan before turning back, and by the autumn of 1516, he had entered into negotiations with Francis. The resulting Treaty of Brussels, concluded on December 6, 1516, not only accepted French occupation of Milan, but also confirmed Venetian claims to the remainder of the imperial possessions in Lombardy, except for Cremona, effectively ending the war with a return to the status quo of 1508. By the same treaty, Emperor Maximilian agreed to end all hostilities by accepting the truce with Venice, and already by January 1517 key provisions of the treaty were put in effect. All military operations were ceased, and Verona was surrendered to the Venetians in Venice. The end of war was marked by various celebrations that took place from January to March 1517. The peace, however, would last only 4 years. The growing rivalry between the House of Valois and the House of Habsburg, and the election of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, would soon lead to the Italian War of 152,126. Sensing Cesare's weakness, the dispossessed lords of the Romagna offered to submit to the Republic of Venice in exchange for aid in regaining their dominions. The Venetian Senate accepted and had taken possession of Rimini, Faenza, and a number of other cities by the end of 1503. Julius II, having secured his own control of the papal armies by arresting and imprisoning Cesare, first in Bologna and later in Ravenna, quickly moved to re-establish papal control over the Romagna by demanding that Venice return the cities she had seized. The Republic of Venice, although willing to acknowledge papal sovereignty over these port cities along the Adriatic coast and willing to pay Julius II an annual tribute, refused to surrender the cities themselves. In response, Julius concluded an alliance with France and the Holy Roman Empire against Venice. The death of Isabella I of Castile, November 26, 1504, and the resulting collapse of relations between the parties soon dissolved the alliance. The Treaty of Blois, 1504, which had ended the Italian Wars of 1499-1504, became a dead letter, but not before Venice had been induced to abandon several of the cities, except for the 3 key towns of Rimini, Faenza, and Servia. Julius, although unsatisfied with his gains, did not himself possess sufficient forces to fight the Republic. For the next 2 years he instead occupied himself with the reconquest of Bologna and Perugia, which, located between Papal and Venetian territory, had in the meantime assumed a status of quasi-independence. In 1507, Julius returned to the question of the cities in Venetian hands. Once again rebuffed by the Senate, he encouraged Emperor Maximilian I to attack the Republic. Maximilian, using his journey to Rome for the imperial coronation as a pretext, entered Venetian territory with a large army in February 1508 and advanced on Vicenza, but was defeated by a Venetian army under Bartolomeo di Alviano, Battle of Cadore, March 2, 1508. A second assault by a Tyrolean force several weeks later was an even greater failure. Alviano not only routed the imperial army, but also seized the entire county of Gorizia, Austrian Istria, county of Pazin, as well as Trieste, Fiume, and the westernmost portions of Carniola. forcing Maximilian to conclude a truce with Venice. In the spring of 1508, the Republic provoked Julius by appointing her own candidate to the vacant bishopric of Vicenza. In response, the Pope called for all Christian nations to join him in an expedition to subdue Venice. On December 10, 1508, representatives of the papacy, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Ferdinand II of Aragon concluded the League of Cambrai against the Republic. The agreement provided for the complete dismemberment of Venice's territory in Italy and for its partition among the signatories. Maximilian, in addition to regaining Gorizia, Trieste, and eastern Istria, would receive Verona, Vicenza, Padua, and the Friuli. France would annex Brescia, Crema, Bergamo, and Cremona to its Milanese possessions. Ferdinand would seize Otranto, and the remainder, including Rimini and Ravenna, would be added to the Papal States. After the creation of the League of Cambrai, the danger to the Republic of Venice became imminent already in January 1509. The French ambassador left Venice, and by April the French king formally declared war to the Republic. On April 27, Pope Julius II issued the interdict against the Venetians. In the same time, the Venetian Senate ordered to assemble an army of about 50,000 soldiers in Pontevico, along the Oglio River, while the main Venetian generals assembled in its castle. On May 9, 1509, Louis crossed the Adda River at the head of a French army of about 40,000 soldiers and moved rapidly into Venetian territory. To oppose him, Venice had hired a condottiere army under the command of the Orsini cousins Bartolomeo di Alviano and Nicol di Pitigliano, but had failed to account for their disagreement on how best to stop the French advance. On May 14, Alviano confronted the French at the Battle of Agnadello. Outnumbered, he sent requests for reinforcements to his cousin, who replied with orders to break off the battle and continued on his way. Alviano, disregarding the new orders, continued the engagement. His army was eventually surrounded and destroyed. Pitigliano managed to avoid encountering Louis, but his mercenary troops, hearing of Alviano's defeat, had deserted in large numbers by the next morning, forcing him to retreat to Treviso with the remnants of the Venetian army. The Venetian collapse was complete. Louis proceeded to occupy Venetian territory as far east as Brescia without encountering any significant resistance. The Venetians lost all the territory that they had accumulated in northern Italy during the previous century. The major cities that had not been occupied by the French Padua, Verona, and Vicenza left undefended by Pitigliano's withdrawal, and quickly surrendered to Maximilian when imperial emissaries arrived in the Veneto. Julius invaded the Romagna and captured Ravenna with the assistance of Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara d'Este, having joined the League and been appointed Gonfalonier on April 19, seized the pole sign for himself. The newly arrived imperial governors, however, quickly proved to be unpopular. In mid-July, the citizens of Padua, aided by detachments of Venetian cavalry under the command of the Proveditore Andrea Gritti, revolted. The lanzknechts garrisoning the city were too few in number to mount effective resistance, and Padua was restored to Venetian control on July 17. The success of the revolt finally pushed Maximilian into action. In early August, a massive imperial army, accompanied by bodies of French and Spanish troops, set out from Trento into the Veneto. Because of a lack of horses, as well as general disorganization, Maximilian's forces were slow to begin the siege of Padua, giving Pitigliano the time to concentrate such troops as were still available to him in the city. Although French and imperial artillery successfully breached Padua's walls, the defenders managed to hold the city until Maximilian, growing impatient, lifted the siege on October 1 and withdrew to Tyrol with the main part of his army. In mid-November, Pitigliano returned to the offensive, recapturing Vicenza, Este, Feltri, and Belluno. An attack on Verona failed, but Pitigliano destroyed a papal army under Francesco II of Gonzaga in the process. Angelo Trevisan organized a river attack on Ferrara by the Venetian galley fleet, but the resulting Battle of Polsella ended in another defeat for the Republic when the Venetian ships anchored in the Po River were sunk by Ferrari's artillery. Faced with a shortage of both funds and men, the Senate decided to send an embassy to Julius in order to negotiate a settlement. The terms insisted on by the Pope were harsh. The Republic lost her traditional power to appoint clergy in her territory, as well as all jurisdiction over papal subjects in Venice. The Romagnan cities that had prompted the war were to be returned to Julius, and reparations were to be paid to cover his expenses in capturing them. The Senate argued over the terms for 2 months, but finally accepted them in February 1510, even before the Venetian ambassadors had presented themselves to Julius for absolution, however. The Council of Ten had privately resolved that the terms had been accepted under duress and were therefore invalid, and that Venice should violate them at the earliest opportunity. The peace agreement between the Pope and the Venetians was concluded on February 15, 1510, and already on February 24 Julius officially revoked the interdict that was imposed on the Venetians in 1509. This apparent reconciliation between Venice and the Pope did not stop multiple French, Ferrarese, and imperial armies from invading Venetian territory in May 1510. Gianpaolo Baglioni and Andrea Gritti, left in command of the Venetian forces by Pitigliano's death in January, withdrew to Padua. By May 24, the League's armies had taken Vicenza and the Polesine, and were advancing on Legnago. Gritti fortified Padua for an expected attack by a combined Franco-Imperial army, but Louis, frustrated by Maximilian's failure to appear in person and distracted by the death of his advisor, the Cardinal d'Amboise, abandoned his plans for a siege. By concluding peace with the Venetians, the Pope effectively left the League of Cambrai, but other members of the League continued to wage war against the Republic. Meanwhile, Julius had become increasingly concerned by the growing French presence in Italy. More significantly, alienated from Alfonso d'Este by friction over a license for a salt monopoly in the Papal States and Alfonso's continued forays against Venetian forces to secure his recently reacquired Polesine, he had formulated plans to seize the Duchy of Ferrara, a French ally, and to add its territory to the Papal States. His own forces being inadequate for the venture, the Pope hired an army of Swiss mercenaries, ordering them to attack the French in Milan. He also invited Venice to ally with him against Louis. The Republic, facing a renewed French onslaught, readily accepted the offer. Thus, the Pope switched sides in the war, joining Venice against France, but without entering into direct conflict against other remaining members of the League, the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. By July 1510, the new Veneto-Papal alliance was on the offensive. An initial attack on French-occupied Genoa failed, but Venetian troops under Lucio Malvezzo finally drove the French from Vicenza in early August, and a joint force commanded by Francesco Maria della Rovere, the Duke of Urbino, captured Modena on August 17. Julius now excommunicated Alfonso d'Este, thus justifying an attack on the Duchy of Ferrara itself. In anticipation of his coming victory, the Pope traveled to Bologna, so as to be nearby when Ferrara was taken. The French army, however, had been left unopposed by the Swiss, who, having arrived in Lombardy, had been bribed into leaving by Louis, and was free to march south into the heart of Italy. In early October, Charles II d'Amboise advanced on Bologna, splitting the papal forces. By October 18th, he was only a few miles from the city. Julius now realized that the Bolognese were openly hostile to the papacy and would not offer any resistance to the French. Left with only a detachment of Venetian cavalry, he resorted to excommunicating d'Amboise, who had in the meantime been convinced by the English ambassador to avoid attacking the person of the Pope and had thus withdrawn to Ferrara. In December 1510, a newly assembled papal army conquered Concordia and besieged the fortress of Mirandola. D'Amboise, marching to relieve the latter, fell ill and died, briefly leaving the French in disarray. The Pope took personal command of the siege, and Mirandola fell in January 1511. Alfonso d'Este, meanwhile, confronted and destroyed the Venetian forces on the Po River, leaving Bologna isolated once more. Julius, afraid of being trapped by the French, departed the city for Ravenna. Cardinal Francesco Alidossi, whom he left behind to command the defense of the city, was no better liked by the Bolognese than Julius himself had been, and when, in May 1511, a French army commanded by John Giacomo Trivulzio approached, the citizens of Bologna revolted, expelled Alidosai, and opened their gates to the French. Julius blamed this defeat on the Duke of Urbino, who, finding this quite unfair, proceeded to murder Alidosai in full view of the papal guard. In order to break up the League of Cambrai, the Pope initiated separate negotiations with Emperor Maximilian and King Ferdinand. Thus, in 1511, the declining alliance was additionally weakened, since Spain decided to abandon the League. Hoping to seize Navarre from Queen Catherine and Lombardy from the French, King Ferdinand decided to support Pope's anti-French policies. On October 4, 1511, the Pope proclaimed the creation of a new alliance, known as the Holy League, that was initially consisting of the Papal States, Venice, and Spain. It was designed to suppress the French ambitions in Italy. The Holy League was also joined by Henry VIII of England who, having decided to use the occasion as an excuse to expand his holdings in northern France, concluded the anti-French Treaty of Westminster with Ferdinand on November 17. The Pope also hoped to win over Emperor Maximilian, who was still reluctant to break alliance with France. The Emperor avoided joining the Holy League, but he accepted the Pope's mediation, and on April 6, 1512, the truce was concluded in Rome between the Emperor and the Venetians. Maximilian ratified the truce on May 20, thus ending his participation in the anti-Venetian War. Being left by his major allies, King Louis and his remaining supporters in Italy, Alfonso I d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, continued the war against Venice and its new allies. Louis appointed his nephew, Gaston de Foix, to command the French forces in Italy. Foy proved more energetic than d'Amboise and Trivulzio had been. Having checked the advance of Ram de Cardona's Spanish troops on Bologna, he returned to Lombardy to sack Brescia, which had rebelled against the French and garrisoned itself with Venetian troops. Aware that much of the French army would be diverted to deal with the impending English invasion, Foy and Alfonso d'Este besieged Ravenna, the last papal stronghold in the Romagna, in hopes of forcing the Holy League into a decisive engagement. Cardona marched to relieve the city in early April 1512 and was decisively beaten in the resulting Battle of Ravenna, fought on Easter Sunday. The death of Foy during the fighting, however, left the French under the command of Jacques de la Palisse, who, unwilling to continue the campaign without direct orders from Louis, contented himself with thoroughly sacking Ravenna. By May 1512, the French position had deteriorated considerably. Julius had hired another army of Swiss mercenaries. They descended on Milan, bringing with them Maximilian Sforza, who was determined to regain control of the duchy for his family. The French garrisons abandoned the Romagna, where the Duke of Urbino quickly captured Bologna and Parma, and retreated to Lombardy, attempting to intercept the invasion. By August, the Swiss had combined with the Venetian army and forced Trivulzio out of Milan, allowing Sforza to be proclaimed duke with their support. La Palisse was then forced to withdraw across the Alps. In 1512, Thomas Grey, 2nd Marquis of Dorset, led an unsuccessful English military expedition to France to reconquer Aquitaine, which England had lost during the 100 Years' War. Ferdinand of Aragon gave none of the support he had promised. While Ferdinand delayed and tried to persuade Dorset to help him to attack Navarre instead of Aquitaine, the English army's food, beer, and pay ran out. Many took to wine and became ill, and the army mutinied. In late August, the members of the Holy League met at Mantua with representatives of the Emperor Maximilian to discuss the situation in Italy and the partition of territory acquired from the French. They quickly came to an agreement regarding Florence, which had angered Julius by allowing Louis to convene the Council of Pisa in its territory. At the Pope's request, Ramon de Cardona marched into Tuscany, smashed Florentine resistance, overthrew the Florentine Republic, and installed Giuliano de' Medici as ruler of the city. On the subject of territory, however, fundamental disagreements quickly arose. Julius and the Venetians insisted that Maximilian Sforza be permitted to keep the Duchy of Milan, while Emperor Maximilian and Ferdinand maneuvered to have one of their relatives installed as duke. The Pope demanded the annexation of Ferrara to the Papal States. Ferdinand objected to this arrangement, desiring the existence of an independent Ferrara to counter growing papal power. The emperor refused to relinquish any imperial territory, which in his eyes included most of the Veneto, and signed an agreement with the Pope to exclude Venice entirely from the final partition. When the Republic objected, Julius threatened to revive the League of Cambrai against her, but died on February 21, 1513, and Cardinal Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent and elder brother of the new ruler of Florence, was elected Pope Leo X. The anti-French Holy League died with Pope Julius II taking advantage. Venice turned to Louis. On March 23, 1513, a treaty pledging to divide all of northern Italy between France and the Republic was signed at Blois. In late May 1513, a French army commanded by Louis de la Tremoille crossed the Alps and advanced on Milan. At the same time, Bartolomeo di Alviano and the Venetian army marched west from Padua. The unpopularity of Maximilian Sforza, who was seen by the Milanese as a puppet of his Swiss mercenaries, enabled the French to move through Lombardy with little resistance. Tremoille, having seized Milan, besieged the remaining Swiss in Novara. On June 6, the French were attacked by a Swiss relief army at the Battle of Novara, and were routed despite having superior numbers. Detachments of the Swiss army pursued the fleeing French over the Alps and had reached Dijon before being bribed into withdrawing. The rout at Novara inaugurated a period of defeats for the French alliance. English troops under Henry VIII besieged Rouen, defeated La Palais at the Battle of the Spurs, and captured Tournai. In Navarre, resistance to Ferdinand's invasion collapsed. He rapidly consolidated his hold over the entire region and moved to support another English offensive in the Guienne. James IV of Scotland invaded England at the behest of Louis, but he failed to draw Henry's attention from France, and his death and the Scots' catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Flodden on September 9, 1513, ended Scotland's brief involvement in the war. Meanwhile, Alviano, unexpectedly left without French support, retreated into the Veneto, pursued closely by the Spanish army under Cardona, while the Spanish were unable to capture Padua in the face of determined Venetian resistance. They penetrated deep into Venetian territory and by late September were in sight of Venice itself. Cardona attempted a bombardment of the city that proved largely ineffective, then, having no boats with which to cross the Venetian lagoon, turned back for Lombardy. Alviano, having been reinforced by hundreds of volunteers from the Venetian nobility, pursued Cardona and confronted him outside Vicenza on October 7. In the resulting Battle of La Matta, the Venetian army was decisively defeated, with many prominent noblemen cut down outside the city walls as they attempted to flee. In November, the Pope proposed peace negotiations between the Venetians and the Emperor, and in December appealed again to the Emperor and all of imperial electors to end hostilities against the Venetians and the French. But Cardona and Alviano continued to skirmish in the Friuli for the remainder of 1513 and through 1514. On March 13, 1514 at Orleans, a one-year truce was concluded when the French king on the one side and Emperor Maximilian and King Ferdinand of Aragon on the other.